Leaders of the world's wealthiest countries have gathered in London for the first in-person G7 summit since 2019. Two words have dominated the headlines since end of 2019, China and coronavirus. And undeniably, these two words dominated the summit as well. Today, the G7 members will discuss coronavirus vaccines as they face growing pressure to share stockpiles and know-how with poor nations trailing far behind on fighting the pandemic. Talking on this, British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said that it is now up to the G7 to decide how they help the vulnerable countries.
Broader point, and again a really valuable part of the G7 format is to think in the round, what do we do to help the most vulnerable countries around the world? I think COVAX and the ability to fund it, get vaccines to the most vulnerable countries, what we do about surplus domestic supply.
Wealthy nations have put an emphasis on COVAX, a UN-backed program meant to share vaccines with the poorest nations. But they were also the ones who cornered poor nations in the race for vaccines and currently hoard millions of surplus doses. Britain invited India to the G7 talks. India is a close democratic ally to the United Kingdom and also a key player when it comes to China and the Indo-Pacific. The second day of the talks focused on China and its growing threat in the strategically crucial Indo-Pacific region. The ministers discussed how to form a common front towards an increasingly assertive China. The leaders talked about China's collective threat to the geopolitical order. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, and I quote, "It is not our purpose to try to contain China or to hold China down, but the West would defend the international rules-based order from subversive attempts by any country, including China." The ministers voiced alarm about China's human rights record amid outrage over the mass incarceration of Uyghur Muslims, as well as on Beijing's coercive economic policies towards other nations. WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidan Sibal, is joining us live for more on this. On day one of the foreign ministers' meet at G7, the focus was on China, with nations seeking common front against Beijing's growing hegemony. How significant was this in the context of India?
Well, today is the last day, the third day of the G7 meeting, which is taking place in London, the physical meeting between the foreign ministers of these 7 countries, the rich countries. What is interesting is that meeting is taking place amidst the COVID pandemic. A meeting is taking place after a gap of 2.5 years. The last time such meeting happened of the foreign ministers of the G7 countries was in France in 2019. But talking about your question right now, of course, China remains a worry for these countries. In fact, the big question is now how basically to tell to China, stop basically violating the rules-based order. But what is interesting this time at the G7 meeting is that countries like India, Australia, South Korea, and of course the chief of the ASEAN grouping has been invited. In fact, today is the day dedicated to these guests, and in a short while from now, when the G7 meeting begins, it will be G7 meeting plus the guests who will be participating in several topics like health, like climate change, on girls' education. These will be the focus area, and of course there will be a family photo as well. Of course, India has been invited, not for the first time at the G7 meeting. It has been invited for last 3 consecutive times, starting with France first inviting, then US President Donald Trump, but of course the summit did not happen. And this year, UK has invited both for the foreign ministers meeting, and of course later when the leaders meet in Cornwall in UK for the leadership meeting. Of course, it is as of now not known if the Prime Minister of India will go to UK or not, given the present COVID situation here in India. But it looks like the big focus will be how these democratic countries can come together, of course, to not only solve challenges like climate change, coronavirus, but also a strong opposition to what China has been doing.
Siddharth, the pandemic and vaccines is going to dominate G7 talks today. Can we expect any major statement, especially in the context of vaccine distribution?
Well, when it comes to vaccination, that of course remains a key topic of discussion. India is a major manufacturing base of vaccine, but given how situation has panned out here in India, the second wave has wreaked devastation. We know that COVAX is not getting those supplies from India now, and that of course remains a big worry. So it is expected that conversations happen. In fact, Sweden recently announced that it is going to give vaccines, AstraZeneca vaccines, to COVAX. That, of course, was welcomed by the World Health Organization, given that it's not going to get supplies from India, but largely India is expected to ramp up its production. We know that the Quad COVID initiative was all about India being the center of the vaccine production, and of course financed by the US and Japan. So largely vaccination is something that is an ongoing conversation, and G7 is no different. We do expect a lot of emphasis when the G7 meeting gets over with the statements coming out, a lot of emphasis on the vaccination and how to ramp up vaccination globally.
Sidan Sibal, WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, thank you very much.